Hand over the key, Patricia said, fingers pinched like she was plucking lint off a suit. Your access is suspended as of this morning. I stood at the pool gate, the latch biting my palm, the bronze plaque with my wife's name catching the Florida sun behind her. You heard the notice, she added, smug. Delinquent amenity fees, trespass and fines if you step through. I wouldn't test that gate, I said, calm. The torque on the closer will slam it hard enough to fail the new lock you installed. Her eyes flicked to the hinge. I spec'd it, I added softly. I built this pool. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. Names: Daniel Ruiz, civil engineer, licensed contractor, 20 years in water structures. I donated the design here, supervised the pour, set those lane anchors with my own hands. The board back then knew exactly what they were asking me to do and what I gave up to do it. You can guess how many shortcuts I left buried in this concrete. None. The plaque at my shoulder held Marta's name. She'd found a quiet, buoyant hour in this water, when chemo made everything else feel like gravel. The lane lines she loved, blue on blue, became our way of measuring time we couldn't keep. I'd promised her the pool would stay open to our neighbors who needed it like she did. The seniors stretching their knees, the kids learning to float before they learned to fear, the exhausted parents who just wanted 30 clean minutes where the world didn't ask for more. That key wasn't just metal. It was a small covenant between grief and grace. Patricia's clipboard hovered. Rules are rules, Mr. Ruiz. Then you'll want the right ones, I said. Not the ones you made up yesterday. The board updated the bylaws, she replied. Properly noticed. Properly filed. Filed where? I asked, not moving. With which clerk? Under what instrument number? Her jaw tightened, just enough to tell me I was standing in the seam she thought no one would find. Behind her, the morning crowd stalled. Coach Ramirez with a mesh bag of kickboards, 3 seniors in sun hats, 2 toddlers wriggling in float sleeves, a teen lifeguard twirling a whistle she hadn't yet earned the confidence to blow. Brian Cho lingered near the lifeguard stand, pretending to check the skimmer basket, pretending not to watch. He wasn't the enemy. He was the silence that makes a lie sound official. Last notice, Patricia said. Key. Now I flattened my hand on the warm bronze. The screws were original. I knew because I'd driven them in. You changed the locks at night, I said. No posted notice, no 30-day window. You floated amenity fees this week that aren't permitted by the grant that funded this deck. And your amended bylaws, if they exist on paper at all, didn't pass through the county the way you're suggesting. She laughed once. Conspiracy theories? Cute. Engineering is just proof with math, I said. Governance is proof with process. Where are you watching from? Because I need you to picture this gate, this plaque, this moment when a rule turns into a weapon and a community holds its breath. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to keep a promise. The morning smelled like sunscreen and wet concrete. The pump thrummed under the deck, and the stainless hinges creaked the same way they had the day I tuned them, with a dab of lithium grease. I remembered Marta's fingers tracing the etched letters after a hard swim, the way she'd nod once, like finishing a lap under a sky that didn't always cooperate. This was her place as much as mine, and what Patricia was doing wasn't order. It was erasure. Delinquent, she said again, savoring the word. Prove it, I said, and let the quiet widen until the kids stopped fidgeting. Show me your authority. Show me the filing. Show me the grant writer you claim to override. Her pen clicked, once, twice, the kind of clatter that tells you the bluff doesn't have a second act. Brian shifted. He knew about the email from 2 years back, the one where the board planned to clean up the bylaws later. He knew about the late-night lock change. He knew what later turns into when power finds a soft corner. His gaze landed on the plaque, then slid away fast, like touching a hot stove he still needed. I didn't step through the gate. Not yet. I didn't need to. Strategy wasn't about motion. It was about position. A community pool funded with municipal support carried conditions Patricia didn't own. A lifetime access clause tied to donated professional services didn't evaporate because a new president preferred tribute over compliance. And a set of amendments without proper recording was just printer ink pretending to be law. Coach, I said without looking back, hold your class at the shallow end for now. No one crosses until this is clarified, he understood. The seniors nodded, even the lifeguards stopped twirling. Last chance, Patricia said. For you, I answered. Because once we move from clipboard to county seal, there's no charm that fixes a bad process. And you know the insurer is going to love the phrase ultra vires stapled to a lock invoice. Some fights start loud. Mine started with a plaque warming my palm, a hinge I could rebuild blindfolded, and the quiet certainty that process beats posture. I kept my key. I kept my ground. And I took a slow breath that tasted like chlorine, sun, and a promise I intended to keep, no matter how many gates they slammed in my way. I left the gate with my key still in my pocket, the bronze plaque burning a memory into my hand even after I let go. The seniors and kids filtered into the shallow end behind me once Coach Ramirez gave a cautious nod. Patricia stayed at the gate, lips pinched, clipboard held like a weapon she didn't quite know how to swing anymore. But I knew she wasn't finished. Bullies never are. The clubhouse corridor smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet glue, a hallway lined with corkboards and laminated notices that curled at the corners. I walked it slow, scanning the mess of papers tacked up under thumbtacks and fading tape. Bright red, amenity delinquency flyers stood out. Patricia's handiwork. Names weren't listed, but the language was blunt. Access suspended, fines accruing, payment required before privileges restored. The wording hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about me. Parents I knew would see this and wonder if they'd missed a bill. Retirees on fixed incomes would panic. Anyone who didn't push back would fold fast, because the notice sounded official, even though I could already see the flaws. No statutory citation, no county seal, just HOA letterhead and Patricia's signature in ink thicker than the text itself, as if that made her claim weightier. Two women paused at the board while I read. Tina Alvarez, a young mom who lived 3 doors down, whispered to her friend about losing her daughter's swim slot. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain to the little girl why they couldn't use the pool that week. The child tugged her sleeve, pointing at a cartoon dolphin on the flyer. It wasn't confusion, it was loss, scaled down to a toddler's world. I stepped closer, tracing the line that claimed, "Revised bylaws authorize suspension of privileges for delinquent amenity fees." The word revised should have come with a date, a reference, or at least an acknowledgement of filing. Instead, it floated in space, untethered. My engineering brain read it like a cracked weld, hidden stress waiting to shear apart. Behind me, Brian Cho's shoes scuffed against the tile. He stopped a few feet away, hands buried in his pockets, pretending to study the same board. He didn't speak, but I could feel his silence pressing against my back. He wanted me to know he was there without declaring a side. His eyes kept flicking from the flyers to me, then down to the floor. A man caught between conscience and convenience. Patricia's flyers weren't just threats. They were pressure valves. She was tightening them across the community to see who would squeal first. I'd seen the same tactic in project negotiations. Overcharge one subcontractor, underpay another, and wait to see who had the stomach to fight. Most never did. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the board, not just the flyer, but the entire mess. Overlapping notices, outdated pool schedules, contradictory parking rules. Together, they told a story of sloppiness, not authority. If Patricia wanted to play the rules game, she'd pick the wrong opponent. I'd spent my life proving structures safe under pressure. Her paperwork was all ready. Bending Tina caught my eye as she tried to comfort her daughter. She didn't know what I'd do with the picture, but she nodded once as if handing me a piece of quiet trust. That trust mattered. It meant people were watching, hoping someone would cut through the noise. I kept moving, out through the side door, where sunlight washed the courtyard, and the faint smell of chlorine drifted in the breeze. I thought about Marta, about the way she'd grip my hand when she was too weak to swim, but still wanted to sit by the pool and listen to the laughter echo off the water. The idea of someone like Patricia treating that place as her personal toll booth made my chest tighten. This wasn't about fees. It was about erasure disguised as governance. I looked back once at the flyers through the glass door. Each one was another nail Patricia thought she could drive into the community's backbone. But I'd seen enough to know the hammer she held was made of soft metal. It was only a matter of time before it bent in her hands. I pocketed my phone and headed home. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was the neighborhood's. And if Patricia thought she could rewrite rules without process, she'd soon learn the difference between letterhead and law. I left the clubhouse behind me, the photo of Patricia's flyers still glowing on my phone screen, and cut across the courtyard toward the pool deck. The sound of splashing carried on the air, kids squealing as Coach Ramirez shouted encouragement over the whistle. I wanted to watch the class for a moment, to remind myself why this mattered, but my attention snagged on someone standing apart from the group near the lifeguard stand, Brian Cho. He was bent over the skimmer basket, hands trembling slightly as he fished out leaves that weren't really there. Every few seconds his eyes darted toward the gate where Patricia had made her stand earlier, then back to me. When I stepped closer, he stiffened, shoulders pulled tight like a man holding a weight he couldn't put down. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice low. He nodded without looking up. The basket rattled in his grip, knuckles whitening around the rim. His mouth opened once, then closed, like words had risen but never made it past his teeth. The lifeguard called to him, asking if the filter looked clear. Brian gave a jerky thumbs up, though he hadn't even checked. His forehead was damp, not from the heat, but from the strain of standing on both sides of a line he couldn't admit existed. I leaned on the fence, watching Coach Ramirez line up the seniors for slow leg lifts. "She's moving fast," I said, just enough for him to hear. "Notices, lock changes, new bylaws." Brian's jaw flexed. He set the basket down hard, the metal clanging against the concrete. His hands lingered on the rim too long, fingers twitching, then he shoved them deep into his pockets. He finally glanced at me, and his eyes betrayed what his silence tried to bury. Fear, yes, but also conflict. The kind that gnaws when you know the truth, but lack the courage to drag it into daylight. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, shoulders hunched as if making himself smaller might erase the fact that he was standing in the middle of it. I didn't push him, I just waited. The pump motor thrummed beneath us, a steady reminder that structures obeyed rules whether people liked them or not. Brian swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, and finally muttered, "She says it's handled." The words came out thin, almost apologetic. "She says a lot," I answered, "but bylaws don't amend themselves, and grant conditions don't disappear." At that, his hands twitched again, pulling free from his pockets to smooth invisible wrinkles on his shirt. He didn't argue, didn't deny it. He just looked past me at the plaque glinting near the entrance, then dropped his gaze so fast it was almost painful to watch. It was the kind of body language you see on a construction site when a worker knows a measurement is off, but fears speaking up will cost him the job. The fidgeting, the shallow breaths, the refusal to meet your eye for long. Guilt leaves a trail, even silence can't cover. Coach Ramirez blew his whistle, and the class laughed as water splashed against the edge. Brian flinched at the sound, like a man yanked from thoughts he didn't want. He bent for the basket again, though it was already empty, just to give his hands something to do. "She's changing the locks again tonight," he whispered, almost too soft to catch. Then he shook his head, eyes wide, like he regretted letting the words escape. He crouched, pretending to adjust the filter line, but his fingers shook against the valve. I straightened. "Thank you," I said simply, but he waved a hand, dismissing it as if I'd misheard. His body stayed crouched longer than necessary, hiding his face, hiding the turmoil written across it. When he finally stood, his posture was stiff, forced, like a soldier snapping to attention to cover the stumble just before. The struggle was written in every gesture. He wanted to side with Patricia because fear made obedience easier, but he wanted to side with the truth because the weight of silence was already bending him. That tension would break him eventually. The only question was which direction he'd fall. I left him by the skimmer basket, the whistle still echoing across the water. I didn't need his words yet. His body had already told me enough. I walked away from the pool deck, with Brian's whispered warning still circling in my head. "She's changing the locks again tonight." His voice, strained and guilty, had carried more weight than he realized. If Patricia was moving under cover of darkness, it meant she knew her authority was flimsy. Real process doesn't hide, only power plays do. That evening, I made a deliberate loop through Cypress Lakes estates, cutting across the palm-lined, walking trail that circled the tennis courts and passed behind the maintenance shed. The air smelled of cut grass and chlorine, carried on a humid breeze. I slowed as I neared the pump alcove tucked behind the fence. The gate gleamed with a new brass lock that hadn't been there that morning. The change was obvious to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The gate itself was commercial grade, its hinge plates drilled into concrete footings I'd helped pour. But the lock Patricia had ordered was residential, a cheap hardware store cylinder never rated for outdoor moisture. Within 6 months, the mechanism would seize from corrosion. Within a year, the latch would sag enough to fail. She had traded durability for the appearance of control, and to me, that mistake was as loud as a gunshot. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and traced the mounting screws. The edges of the metal around them still showed bright burrs, proof that the lock had been installed hastily without proper countersinking. Patricia hadn't called a licensed contractor. She'd sent a handyman, or worse, someone working cash under the table. No permits, no inspection. Another crack in her armor. The violation notice was taped directly to the gate. This one named me, bold letters shouting, "Trespass warning, Daniel Ruiz." It accused me of unauthorized use of maintenance access and threatened escalating fines. My name, in public, for neighbors to see on their way to swim practice or aqua therapy. The intent was humiliation, but all I saw was opportunity. She had tied her authority to a piece of paper that wouldn't survive scrutiny. I crouched near the pump alcove, listening to the motor's steady churn beneath the deck. I knew every decibel of that sound, knew when bearings wore down or when cavitation stole efficiency. Tonight, it was running clean, proof that the maintenance schedule I'd designed still held. Patricia could tape as many notices as she wanted, but the pool's very operation answered to engineering, not her pen. The humid air pressed against my skin as I stood, the flyer flapping in the breeze like a flag of overreach. A couple walked by, slowing to read it. The woman frowned, whispering to her husband, eyes darting toward me. Embarrassment was what Patricia wanted, but instead it seeded doubt. Why would the man who built the pool be labeled a trespasser? I photographed the lock, the burrs, the flyer, the absence of a permit sticker. Each image added weight to the case forming in my mind. Bylaws were one thing, building code and county jurisdiction were another. Patricia was slipping outside the lines, and I intended to catch her in it. As I walked back toward the tennis courts, the faint thwack of rackets echoing in the night, I thought about Marta. She'd trusted me to hold the line, to keep the place honest. Her voice used to steady me when I doubted myself on big projects. Tonight it was the echo of her laugh that kept me calm. Patricia's power was a bluff, brittle under real scrutiny. And I wasn't here to brawl. I was here to measure, document, and dismantle. By the time I reached home, my shirt was damp with sweat, but my mind felt sharpened. Patricia had handed me exactly what I needed: proof of unilateral action, poor workmanship, and public targeting without proper authority. Each misstep wasn't just arrogance, it was evidence. The kind of evidence that county officers and insurers paid attention to. I slipped my phone onto the charger and sat at my desk, pulling out a yellow notepad. I wrote 3 words at the top: lock, notice, process. Then I drew a line through the first 2. Process was all that mattered. She'd tried to skip it, and soon enough, that was going to cost her more than a brass cylinder and a stack of flyers. Process. That word pulsed through my head the next morning as I drove into town. Patricia could change locks and tack up flyers all she wanted, but without proper authority, her actions were paper thin. If I was going to fight back, I needed something stronger than outrage. I needed proof that the ground under her rules wasn't hers to stand on in the first place. The municipal building sat in the heart of town, a square of beige concrete and glass with palm trees leaning across its steps. Inside, the air was cool and dry, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the lobby. A receptionist pointed me toward the Parks and Recreation counter. I walked past bulletin boards layered with youth soccer schedules and water safety posters until I reached a window framed in dull aluminum. A clerk named Evelyn greeted me with a tired smile. "Help you?" she asked, sliding a stack of forms to the side. "I'm looking for records on the Cypress Lakes Estates pool," I said. "Funding, permits, anything that lists conditions." Her fingers danced across the keyboard, nails clicking like a metronome. A printer behind her whirred to life, coughing out a packet of papers. She handed it through the slot, the top sheet stamped with the county seal. My eyes caught the line almost immediately: Facility construction partially funded under Community Recreation, Grant Program, Section 5, Subdivision Amenities. The wording was clear. Grant conditions required that all subdivision homeowners had equal access to the pool without additional amenity fees beyond standard association dues. Patricia's flyers demanding extra payments weren't just wrong, they directly violated the terms that allowed the pool to be built. I traced the line with my finger, the way Marta used to trace the plaque after her swims. For a moment, the lobby noise faded, and all I heard was the echo of her voice reminding me that promises matter. Patricia wasn't just trying to erase me. She was erasing the very reason this pool had been gifted to the neighborhood. I flipped through the rest of the packet. Meeting minutes from the original grant hearings listed me by name as OS, Project Engineer of Record. My donation of professional services had been documented, not in passing, but as a key contribution. A notation in the margin even stated, lifetime access consideration, per agreement with engineer. It wasn't sentiment, it was record. The victory strategy sharpened right there in my hands. Patricia had been wielding bylaws like weapons, but the bylaws themselves bowed to higher authority. Grants and county records outranked her signatures. She could try to amend, revise, or threaten, but she couldn't rewrite the conditions that funded the very concrete she walked on. I slipped the packet into a folder and signed the request for certified copies. Evelyn stamped it with an ink pad that left a faint chemical tang in the air. "Anything else?" she asked. "This is more than enough," I said. Walking out into the Florida sun, the weight of the papers felt heavier than their few ounces should allow. They weren't just sheets, they were leverage. Proof that Patricia's new amenity fees were legally unenforceable. Proof that her authority had limits she had already crossed. Proof that my wife's memory, etched in bronze at the gate, was shielded by more than sentiment. I sat in my truck for a while, folder open on the passenger seat, letting the pages rustle under the vent. My chest felt tight, but not from anger. It was purpose now. Every pool echo, every whispered doubt from neighbors, every silent plea from Brian's eyes, they all connected to this. A promise kept, not just by me, but by the very documents that built this place. I started the engine, the air conditioning blasting against my face, and steered back towards Cypress Lakes. Patricia thought she could rewrite the story by posting flyers and locks, but the story was already written, stamped, and filed where she couldn't touch it. All I had to do was bring it back into the light. The folder of certified grant records sat on the passenger seat like a second heartbeat all the way home. I parked in my driveway, but instead of heading inside, I carried it straight to my desk in the den. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, striping the papers with pale gold as I spread them out across the wood surface. The pages smelled faintly of toner and ink, sharp and final. I reread the clause about equal access until the words blurred. It wasn't enough to know Patricia was wrong. I needed to anchor the fight in a way no one could dispute. Grants had teeth, but I had something else buried in memory, my original service agreement. The one I'd signed 15 years ago when the board first approached me to design the pool. I turned to the county permitting portal on my laptop. The screen glowed as I navigated through old indices, typing my name into search fields, scrolling past dead links and expired permits. Then, there it was. Pool design, Cypress Lakes Estates. Engineer of record, Daniel Ruiz. I clicked through, pulse racing, and up came a scanned copy of the contract. My signature sprawled across the bottom, dated and sealed. The language was plain. In consideration for donated professional services and supervision of construction, engineer shall receive lifetime access to the facility as member in good standing. Those words weren't just sentiment. They were enforceable. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my hands against my face. For months, Patricia had painted me as delinquent, a trespasser on the very ground I'd built. But here was proof that my presence wasn't an exception. It was a condition of the pool's creation. The smell of chlorine still clung to my clothes from the pool deck earlier. It made the memory of Marta flood back, sitting beside me in the bleachers during construction, hair tucked under a scarf, smiling despite the sickness weighing her down. She had whispered, "This pool will outlast me, Danny. Make sure it's for everyone." And I had promised her. That promise lived now in black ink and county seals. But sentiment couldn't stay sentiment. Patricia's lock changes and flyers were accelerating. If she was willing to post my name publicly once, she'd do it again, louder. Soon the neighborhood would fracture, half believing her, half doubting me. If I didn't act, the damage would spread deeper than bylaws. I pulled out my yellow notepad and wrote 2 headings: grant conditions and service agreement. Under each, I listed the violations Patricia had already committed. Under grant, I wrote, new amenity fees equals prohibited. Under agreement, I wrote, lockouts equals breach of contract. The list grew into a map of her overreach. Each line another nail waiting for a hammer. The urgency pressed in. It wasn't just about defending my key anymore. It was about timing. Patricia was moving quickly, and momentum favors whoever strikes first. If I delayed, she'd solidify her narrative with more notices, more lock changes, maybe even fabricated delinquency tallies. By the time I pulled the law into daylight, the community could already be broken. I decided then. This had to escalate formally, not whispers, not quiet resistance at the gate. I would file with the county and demand a hearing. Process was my weapon, and now I had both the blade and the handle. I packed the documents back into the folder, snapping the clasp shut. The papers shifted with a satisfying rustle, weighty with authority. My hand lingered on the cover as if it were Marta's shoulder. I whispered her name under my breath, a reminder of why this wasn't just about winning. It was about keeping the pool open for every neighbor who needed it. As the sun dipped behind the palms outside, the den filled with shadows stretching long across the floor. I sat with the silence, letting it harden into resolve. Patricia had declared war with locks and paper. I would answer with the very system she thought she controlled. And once the county seal stamped, my complaint, there would be no flyers strong enough to cover it. The folder of documents sat heavy in my briefcase as I stepped into the neighborhood cafe the next morning. The place smelled of roasted beans and buttered croissants, sunlight slanting across mismatched tables. I hadn't invited anyone to meet me, but Brian was already there, hunched over a mug, stirring it long after the cream had blended. His shoulders were rounded, his tie crooked, as though he had dressed in a rush but thought better of showing up at the HOA office first. When he saw me, his stirring stopped. The spoon clinked against ceramic, sharp in the quiet corner. His eyes flicked to the folder at my side, then down again, like he wished he hadn't noticed. I slid into the chair across from him, letting the silence stretch. Patricia's pushing harder, he muttered finally, fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the mug's rim. He looked around the cafe, scanning the door, the counter, anywhere but at me. His body couldn't decide whether to stay or run. You know it, I said, keeping my voice calm. And you also know what she's standing on is rotten. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, then froze halfway. He pressed his lips together, exhaling through his nose. The conflict was visible in every motion, his loyalty to the board clashing with the truth pressing at his conscience. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering. I shouldn't, he whispered, but you need to see this. His hand shook as he tapped the screen and slid the phone across the table. The email chain glared back at me. Subject: Bylaw amendments, status. Patricia's message read, we'll finalize the refiling later, once enforcement is underway. Don't discuss externally. We need results first. The timestamp was 2 years old. The chain that followed showed reminders ignored, drafts abandoned, filings never completed. Brian's knee bounced under the table. His hands had retreated to his lap, clenched together so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He looked like a man confessing a crime he hadn't committed but felt complicit in. Do you realize what this means? I asked. My finger hovered above the line that exposed everything. Every fine, every notice, every lock change tied to these amendments is invalid. She's been enforcing ghost bylaws. He nodded quickly, eyes darting again to the door. Sweat beaded near his temple despite the cafe's cool air. If she finds out I showed you... His voice trailed off, his whole body shrinking against the chair back. She'll push until someone breaks, I said. But it doesn't have to be you. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, as if trying to erase the feeling of passing me the phone. His breathing hitched, shallow and quick. Yet, he didn't take it back. That was his decision, written not in words, but in the way his hands refused to close over the evidence again. I slid the phone back across the table. Send it to yourself. Make sure you have a copy. This isn't just about me. If Patricia keeps this up, she'll drag the whole board down with her. His shoulders rose, then slumped. He wiped his palms against his slacks and whispered, "I just want to do the right thing." "You just did," I said. The cafe noise returned, plates clinking, the hiss of steam wands, a toddler laughing near the pastry case. But at our table, the air felt heavier, charged. Brian had crossed a line, and he knew it. His body showed it, hands trembling, shoulders curled, eyes wet but unspilled. Yet, he hadn't walked away. He had stayed, and that mattered. I packed the folder back into my case. Between the grant conditions, my service agreement, and now this email trail, Patricia's authority had collapsed from 3 angles. She could bluff in front of neighbors, but she couldn't erase paper with stamps, signatures, and her own words. As I stood, Brian grabbed his mug with both hands, clinging to it like an anchor. He didn't meet my eyes again, but he didn't need to. His silence had shifted. It wasn't complicity anymore. It was survival until the truth came out. Walking out into the Florida heat, the documents pressed against my side like armor. The case wasn't just strong, it was airtight. Patricia had chosen to govern without process. Now, process was going to strip her bare. The Florida heat pressed down like a weight as I left the cafe, but the documents in my briefcase made the air feel lighter. The path forward was clear now. Patricia had built her power on threats and shadows, but I had the law, the grants, and her own words. What I needed was structure, an actual plan that would funnel all of it into one undeniable blow. I drove home and set up at my office desk, spreading papers across the surface until it looked like a blueprint table. That was how my mind worked. Measure, align, load paths, find the weak point, and reinforce. Patricia had turned governance into spectacle, but for me, this was just another project. On one side of the desk, I stacked the certified grant conditions. On another, my service agreement. Between them, I placed the printouts Brian had sent me. The damning line where Patricia admitted the bylaw amendments hadn't been filed. 3 separate beams of evidence, all angled toward the same collapse. I drew a triangle on my notepad and labeled the corners: grant, agreement, bylaws. In the center, I wrote process. That word again. The load-bearing pillar. Patricia had tried to build on air, but air doesn't carry weight. I called an attorney I knew from years back, a pro bono consultant who'd helped me review contracts when I donated my time to community projects. His voice came warm but cautious when I explained the situation. "You're holding more than enough," he said after a pause. "File a formal complaint with the county, demand enforcement of the grant conditions, and for the bylaws. Every action taken without proper refiling is void." She's exposed. Hearing it confirmed from a professional steadied me. It wasn't just my interpretation. It was fact. I scribbled notes as he spoke: complaint, demand letter, evidence package. I thanked him, and before we hung up, he added, "Move quickly." People like her double down when they sense their grip slipping. That urgency hummed in my veins as I turned to the next part of the plan: community impact. It wasn't enough to walk into a hearing with papers. I needed testimony, neighbors ready to say out loud what Patricia's overreach had cost them. Tina losing her daughter's swim time, the seniors who worried their therapy sessions were being cut, even Coach Ramirez, whose classes had been disrupted by new restrictions. The more voices, the harder it would be for her to spin the narrative. I opened a spreadsheet and started building a roster: names, incidents, dates. Each cell, another nail in the coffin. The engineer in me loved the symmetry of it, the way data could tell a story more powerful than any speech. Outside my window, kids biked past, their laughter floating up through the open glass. That sound reminded me what was at stake. Marta had wanted this pool to be for everyone, not parceled out like favors from a throne. I pressed my hand against the folder and whispered, "We're almost there." I organized the evidence into sections. Tab A for the grant. Tab B for my service agreement. Tab C for the emails. Behind that, I added a slot for community affidavits once I gathered them. Each page slid into place with the crisp finality of concrete pouring into a form. By the time the sun dipped low, my plan was no longer just an idea. It was a structure, solid and deliberate. I would file the complaint with the county, back it with testimony, and deliver copies to the HOA board. No threats, no bluster, just process. The very thing Patricia had ignored. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion tugging at my shoulders, but replaced by a steady calm. Patricia had chosen intimidation. I had chosen proof, and proof always lasts longer than paper flyers taped to a gate. The plan was drawn. The pieces were aligned. All that was left was to set it in motion. Once the plan was sketched out, the real work began. Paper alone could win a hearing, but people gave it weight. Testimony turned facts into something neighbors could feel, something officials couldn't ignore. That meant canvassing the community, gathering stories Patricia thought she could bury under notices and locks. I started at the senior center's multi-purpose room, a place that always smelled faintly of chlorine and medicated balm, where residents stretched before heading to the pool. Coach Ramirez was there, leading a gentle warm-up for a half circle of retirees. When he spotted me, his brows lifted in relief. "They canceled 2 classes last week," he told me, after dismissing the group. "Said we didn't have the right permits. But this program's been running for years." His voice carried the frustration of a man watching his students lose their only therapy. He signed the affidavit I'd drafted, listing dates and disruptions, his signature heavy and deliberate at the bottom. Next was Tina Alvarez. I found her on her porch, her little girl chasing bubbles that shimmered in the humid air. Tina's hands twisted the hem of her shirt as she described the day she'd been turned away at the gate. "She cried for hours," Tina said, glancing at her daughter. "I told her it wasn't her fault, but how do you explain that to a child?" She agreed to add her story, her pen pressing hard enough to leave indents on the next page. Each conversation built momentum. Neighbors who had stayed silent now leaned in when I approached, lowering their voices to describe late-night emails, whispered threats, extra fees paid just to avoid harassment. Every account was another thread woven into the pattern of Patricia's overreach. I arranged the statements into folders, labeling them carefully. Tab D, Community Impact. It sat behind the legal evidence, not as decoration, but as reinforcement. No one could call this personal when half the neighborhood was testifying. The multi-purpose room became my base for the afternoon. Residents trickled in, curious about the papers spread across the table. Some signed, some simply asked questions, but each left with more doubt about Patricia's authority than they'd walked in with. The chatter grew. Doubt spreads fast in communities built on control. Even Brian appeared, lingering near the doorway. He didn't cross the threshold at first, just leaned against the frame, arms folded, eyes scanning the growing stack of affidavits. His body language was different now, still tense, but less caged. He shifted from one foot to the other, clearly wrestling with whether to step inside. When he finally did, his hands hovered over the papers, almost touching, but pulling back. "She doesn't know about this yet, does she?" His tone was low, but his eyes were locked on the signatures piling up. "No," I said, "and she won't until it's filed." He exhaled, shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked less like a man hiding from guilt, and more like one calculating how long he could stand in the blast radius before the truth blew open. He didn't add his name, not yet, but the way his fingers drummed against the table told me he was closer than he wanted to admit. By evening, I had enough affidavits to fill a binder. Each story fit neatly into the framework I'd built. Grants violated, agreements breached, bylaws unenforceable. And now, real human consequences documented in writing. The evidence wasn't just legal anymore, it was lived. I packed the folders into my briefcase, the weight of it nearly pulling at the handle. Around me, neighbors chatted in low voices, their confidence growing as they realized Patricia's control wasn't inevitable, it was fragile, and fragility exposed is the first step toward collapse. Walking out of the senior center, the humid air hit me like a wall, but it carried a different energy now. The community had spoken. The affidavits were more than signatures. They were a chorus of defiance. Patricia had her flyers. I had their voices. And soon, the county would hear them. The briefcase felt heavier than usual as I carried it up the courthouse steps the next morning. It wasn't just paper. It was every hour of Marta's laughter at the pool, every whispered complaint from neighbors too tired to fight, every lie Patricia had scribbled on her flyers. Today was about putting it into the system she thought she controlled. Inside, the county administrative building hummed with the business of governance. Phones rang behind glass partitions, clerks shuffled papers, and a faint tang of disinfectant clung to the tiled floors. I followed the signs toward public records and complaints, my shoes echoing on the wide hallway until I reached the intake window. The clerk behind the glass was middle-aged, with reading glasses perched halfway down his nose. He didn't look up until I set the briefcase on the counter and pulled out my neatly organized binder. The thud it made drew his eyes. "Complaint filing?" he asked. "Yes," I said, steady. "Cypress Lakes, Estates, Homeowners Association, violations of grant conditions, breach of service agreement, enforcement of unfiled bylaws." His eyebrows lifted slightly. He slid a set of forms under the glass, but when he saw the certified grant records and stamped copies already in order, he slowed down. "You've done your homework." "I'm an engineer," I told him. "Structure's my business." He gave a small smile and stamped the intake page with a sharp crack that echoed down the hall. That sound was more than ink. It was the first crack in Patricia's facade made official. As I filled out the complaint line by line, I thought of the residents whose affidavits filled tab D. Tina's daughter crying at the gate, the seniors missing therapy. Coach Ramirez's classes canceled for no reason other than control. Their voices lived inside this folder now, ready to be read into record. When I signed at the bottom and slid the form back under the glass, the clerk added it to a growing stack of cases. But mine wasn't just another dispute. It carried the county seal now, and that meant Patricia's claims would face scrutiny she couldn't dodge with a smirk or a flyer. "Anything else?" the clerk asked. "Yes," I said. I pulled another envelope from my case. "This is a copy of the same package, addressed to the HOA's insurance carrier. They need to know their insured is enforcing rules without authority. Liability risk." His head tilted slightly like he hadn't expected that. "Smart," he said. I nodded once. It wasn't vindictive. It was strategic. Insurers hate risk, and Patricia's actions were a floodgate wide open. Once they understood she'd been enforcing unfiled bylaws, they'd pressure her harder than any neighbor could. Financial pressure was the lever process often needed. Walking back outside, sunlight blasted across the courthouse steps, heat radiating off the concrete, but my chest felt cool, calm. The filings were done. The evidence was secured. Now Patricia would face the one thing she couldn't control: scrutiny under law. Still, I knew the confrontation wasn't over. Filing was just the foundation. The structure would rise at the next HOA meeting, where the board and neighbors would hear what the county had received. Patricia would try to bluster, maybe even shout me down, but her words would be smoke against the weight of stamped paper and official seals. I paused at the bottom of the steps, briefcase in hand, watching the traffic roll past. My reflection glimmered in the courthouse glass behind me. I looked older than I felt, lines drawn deep from years of work, but my eyes held the same certainty they had the day I promised Marta I'd protect her pool. This wasn't about revenge. It was about process, about memory, about community. Patricia had bet that fear would keep everyone quiet. But I wasn't afraid, and soon no one else would be either. I headed for my truck, briefcase secure on the seat beside me. The engine roared to life, steady as the thrum of the pool pumps I knew so well. The foundation had been poured. The framing was set. Now, all that remained was to raise the structure in front of everyone, where no one could pretend not to see it. By the time I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, cars already lined both sides of the street. The monthly HOA meeting usually drew a handful of retirees and the occasional parent with a complaint about landscaping. Tonight the lot was overflowing. Word had spread about the flyers, the lockouts, and maybe, just maybe, about what I had done at the courthouse. The meeting hall buzzed like a hive when I stepped in, my briefcase tight in my grip. Ceiling fans stirred the humid air, but sweat still clung to foreheads as neighbors filled every folding chair. Others leaned against the walls, arms crossed, waiting. At the front sat Patricia, poised in her chair, gavel in hand. She tapped it once on the table, but the sound barely cut through the murmur. "We'll begin," she announced, her voice carrying that familiar mix of condescension and command. First order of business, delinquent amenity fees. Certain residents continue to ignore their obligations. Enforcement will proceed. She glanced directly at me, her lips curving into a smirk. Some eyes followed hers, landing on me like I was the defendant in a trial. That was her plan, shame me before the crowd. But shame only works if you don't carry proof. I rose slowly, the briefcase clicking open as I pulled out my binder. The sound of paper. Sliding free hushed the room a little, enough for me to speak. Before we talk about obligations, I said, voice steady, we should talk about authority. Who actually has it and who doesn't? Patricia scoffed, gavel tapping again. You're out of order, mister. Ruiz. No, I said, lifting the first document high. You are. Gasps rippled through the room. I laid the certified grant records on the table in front of her. This pool was built with county recreation funds. Conditions state that all subdivision homeowners have equal access without additional amenity fees. Your flyers demanding payment are in direct violation of those terms. Whispers surged across the room. A senior in the second row leaned toward her neighbor, nodding vigorously. Parents craned their necks, eyes wide. Patricia's smirk faltered, but she leaned forward, voice sharp. Those conditions are old. Revised bylaws give us the right. Show the filing, I cut in. I slid Brian's printed email across the table. 2 years ago, you admitted the amendments hadn't been refiled. Every action you've taken under those so-called revisions, every fine, every lock change, is void. This is your own admission, time-stamped, archived, and now on record. The room erupted, murmurs, exclamations, the shuffle of chairs. Someone in the back clapped once sharply, and others followed. Patricia's gavel banged against the table, her face flushed red. Silence, she barked. These are lies, fabrications. I pulled the last sheet from my binder, the one bearing my own signature from 15 years ago. I held it up for all to see. This is the original service agreement. In exchange for donating my professional expertise in supervising construction, I was guaranteed lifetime access to the pool, signed, sealed, and filed with the county. You can tape as many notices as you want to the gate, Patricia, but you can't erase history, and you can't erase law. The crowd broke into applause this time, not just whispers. Tina stood, child on her hip, and called out, "We've had enough." Seniors added their voices, some demanding refunds, others demanding resignations. The noise filled the hall like thunder rolling across water. Patricia slammed the gavel until the head cracked against the table. Her words were lost in the uproar. Beside her, other board members shifted uncomfortably. One leaned back, crossing his arms, while another stared at the table, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Brian was there too, near the front row. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The relief on his face said it all. His silence had finally found release in the roar of the room. I closed the binder and set it down firmly. This isn't just about me, I told the crowd, raising my voice above the noise. It's about every one of you who paid fees you didn't know, who lost access you were promised, who got bullied by threats that meant nothing. That ends tonight. The applause swelled again, neighbors rising to their feet, voices demanding change. Patricia's gavel lay splintered on the table, powerless. And for the first time since this started, the balance of power shifted, not with a lock or a flyer, but with truth spoken in the open, in front of everyone. The room was still ringing from the crowd's applause when Patricia finally shoved back her chair and stormed out, the broken gavel head rolling across the table behind her. Board members scrambled in her wake, some following, some staying planted, but none willing to defend her. The noise settled into murmurs, then into a focused silence as every eye in the clubhouse turned toward me. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was weight. Proof had won the room, but process still had to win the outcome. That meant official rulings, filings, signatures, and I had already set all of it in motion. The next week, the county hearing convened in a narrow chamber with beige walls and rows of metal chairs. Fewer neighbors came, but enough to fill half the seats, their faces intent. Brian sat near the back, his posture still guarded but straighter than before, as if he'd finally chosen a side he could live with. Tina cradled her daughter, and Coach Ramirez leaned on his cane like a man guarding his students. At the front sat the hearings officer, Evelyn Hart. Her gavel wasn't symbolic, it was authority. She adjusted her glasses, looked at the stack of documents in front of her, and spoke clearly. The matter before us concerns enforcement actions by the Cypress Lakes Estates Homeowners Association regarding pool access and amenity fees. Patricia was there, lips tight, flanked by a lawyer whose suit looked sharper than his confidence. He shuffled papers that I knew held no weight against certified grants and archived emails. I presented my binder piece by piece, the grant conditions first, stamped, certified, undeniable. Then the service agreement, my signature, their promise of lifetime access. Finally, the email trail, Patricia's own words exposing the unfiled bylaws. Each document landed on the desk like a stone laid into a foundation. Patricia's lawyer tried to object, arguing technicalities, but Evelyn cut him off. The board's failure to properly refile amendments voids enforcement of those amendments. The grant conditions prohibit additional fees. The service agreement is valid and enforceable. Her gavel cracked once. All fines and suspensions issued under these conditions are invalid. Locks must be restored. Access reinstated. The board is directed to comply with county and grant requirements within 30 days. A quiet exhale swept through the room, like an old burden sliding off many shoulders at once. Brian rubbed his hands together, relief loosening the lines of his face. Tina smiled down at her daughter, whispering something that made the child giggle. Coach Ramirez clapped once, firm and certain. Patricia sat rigid, her knuckles white against the table, but the color had drained from her face. The lawyer leaned close, whispering fast, but she shook him off and stared straight ahead. Authority, once absolute, had been stripped by the very process she ignored. Walking out of the hearing chamber, sunlight poured through the tall windows, warm on my face. Neighbors gathered around, shaking my hand, thanking me, some even apologizing for staying quiet so long. But this wasn't about me alone. It was about all of us. The pool had always been more than water and tile. It was community, memory, and promise. And now, it was safe again. The following Saturday, the pool reopened under new locks installed by licensed contractors, this time inspected and permitted. The bronze plaque gleamed in the morning sun as children cannonballed into the deep end. Seniors stretched in the shallow water, and parents finally relaxed in chairs lining the deck. I stood by the gate, fingers brushing Marta's name, my chest tight but steady. I had kept my word. Brian approached, hands in his pockets, but his posture was different now. He nodded once, gratitude written in the small movements, a man no longer hiding from himself. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did," I answered, watching Tina wave to her daughter splashing nearby. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.